last 9 years, the war with Muslims has achieved nothing for the U.S. except for it has waken up the Muslims for Islam. We're only Muslims trying to defend our people, honor, and land. But if you call us terrorists for doing that, then we are proud terrorists. And we will keep on terrorizing until you leave our land and people at peace. But if you don't, then I remind you that we have watches and we have time. We will defeat you with time. Osama bin Laden had been saying similar things for many years. His three big beefs in the 90s, in this interview with John Miller of ABC News, were these. The government the U.S. government had stationed troops in Saudi Arabia. They were imposing and enforcing sanctions on Iraq that were causing people to starve. And they were supporting Israel in the fight between Israel and Palestine. Incidentally, former Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, one of the leading Bush advocates of war with Iraq, and admitted bin Laden's point about Saudi Arabia after the U.S. troops had left Saudi Arabia. He said, quote, "Their presence there over the last 12 years has been a source of enormous difficulty for a friendly government. It's been a huge recruiting device for al-Qaeda. In fact, if you look at bin Laden, one of his principal grievances was the presence of so-called crusader forces on the Holy Land, Mecca and Medina." So he's essentially admitting that. And incidentally, one of the worst things I think my current Hoover colleague, Condoleezza Rice, did shortly after 9/11 was persuade the major media not to show bin Laden's stages. I'd like to avoid further terrorist attacks, or at least reduce the probability. So I want to know what a terrorist wants. Because if I can give him what he wants, and that makes him drop terrorism, and if I wanted to do those things anyway, that's win-win. And I did want to do those things. I was never an advocate of those sanctions in Iraq. I was never an advocate of the U.S. having troops in Saudi Arabia. I was never wanting the government to take sides in the dispute between Israel and Palestine. Now, by the way, I tend to like to, when I establish a few things, to open it up. So I have a bunch of stuff I want to get to, but I want to open it up in case anyone has a question. I'll either tell you, I'll answer it now, I'll get to it later, whatever. Does anyone have a question at this point or a thought? Sir?
Could you talk a little bit about, you've talked about our support of Iraq fighting Iran. Could you mention how it went back and forth, where at other times we supported Iran and supported them to fight Iraq? And then I think it went back to Iraq.
Yeah, well, the main one, of course, was the Reagan Arms for Hostages deal. So the American government was supporting Iraq in the ways I mentioned earlier in the 1980-88 war. And then Reagan made this secret deal to give the Iranians arms if they would release some later hostages that we were taking. So that was kind of the main thing, was just to supply those arms, unless there's something else you have in mind that I don't know.
I thought there was more, but that's fine.
I don't think so. I don't think so. Anyone else before I sir?
Now, since the I guess the Taliban has spilled over into Pakistan, now they're gaining support from the arms support. They've always had arms support, but they won the hearts of doing humanitarian work for all these poor Pakistanis who have lost their homes to conflict and flood, and are doing all these things. Why have there been any efforts from the United States to give aid to these people, or has it just been the Taliban winning the support from Pakistanis to fight Americans in Afghanistan? Has there been any effort?
Oh, there's been a lot of effort. I talked to my students who've come over, who've been over there, and they're always trying to build schools and roads and stuff. And what will happen is often insurgents will come along and just blow up overnight what they took months to build. So nation building doesn't tend to work, and it kind of goes back to Hayek's point that no foreign guy in Washington knows enough to be able to plan a whole different society. So it'd be just way better to get out of there. Okay, now, but you raised an issue a few minutes ago, and I want to get to that, and I have time. And that is the issue of oil. I wrote a piece for the Independent Institute that's just down the road in Oakland a few years ago, titled, "Do We Need to Go to War for Oil?" And my basic answer is no. And the reason is that oil is an internationally traded commodity. And so it really doesn't matter to us as consumers who's producing the oil as long as they're producing it, because they're going to want to sell it to the highest bidder. And one of the things people have worried about is a selective embargo. So the idea is some country that hates America will single out Americans and say, we won't sell to Americans. There's a problem with that. If the country wants to maintain its current output, it's going to help to sell it to someone. So let's say it sells less to Americans and then sells more to some other country. Then those people in another country don't have to buy as much as they were buying from their suppliers. That frees up supply that we can buy. So it's kind of like a game. You ever play at a birthday party when you were like 9, play musical chairs? Right, where the number of chairs is one less than the number of people? Well, this is musical chairs where the number of chairs equals the number of people. It's a really boring game. But in international trade, boring is good, not bad. And so the most famous example of selective embargo is an example of one that didn't work. In 1973, OAPEC, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, decided to impose an embargo on Holland, on the Netherlands, and the United States because of the side they'd taken in Israel's favor, and said we won't sell to America or the Netherlands anymore. So then they sold to other people, and now the price went up, but that's because they cut output. The price went up to everyone. So whether you were a targeted nation, one of those two targeted nations or not, everyone was paying $11 per barrel. So you can't have a selective embargo. And so we really don't have to worry about who owns the oil. They're going to sell it, we're going to give it. Now let's move beyond the unintended consequences and look at the cost of the two major wars the United States government is involved in. Afghanistan, a hot war, and Iraq, I guess a warm war. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the cost of those together is about $150 billion a year. That's the government outlays for those two wars. Now, to put that in perspective, that's roughly 10% of the U.S. deficit this year. It's roughly 15 to 20% of the U.S. deficit for future years if the United States keeps spending that money. Now, that might be too abstract, so let's get it to a more individual level. There are approximately 300 million individuals in the United States, so 150 billion a year, and there are about 120 million families, roughly 2.5 people per family. So the average cost per American resident is about $500 per year, and the average cost per family is about $1,250 per year. That's a hefty number. Now, averages are almost always misleading. So let's go beyond those and see who actually pays. A starting point is to look at the overall amount of revenue the government collects at the federal level from people in various income groups. The federal tax system, taken as a whole, unlike the state tax system, is progressive. Now, I don't mean progressive in the sense of good or nice. I mean progressive in a simple mathematical sense. As your income goes up, you get into a higher marginal tax bracket. So, for example, in 2005, if you were in the bottom quintile, that is the lowest fifth of households, then according to the CBO, you paid less than 5% of your income in federal taxes of all forms. Every form. Now that might sound low. Why is it? Two reasons. A lot of people in the bottom quintile don't work. And almost all the rest who do work get something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which actually cuts their other taxes and in fact can give them a check. Many of them pay Social Security tax and Medicare tax, but again, many of them don't work, so they don't pay those. And the other taxes they do pay are taxes on alcohol, cigarettes, gasoline, but those at the federal level are not that big a source of revenue. Now consider the other end of the income range, the top quintile. The Congressional Budget Office in 2005 found that households in the top quintile paid about 25% of their income in all federal taxes. Moreover, the top quintile share of all taxes was 68.7%. In other words, the top fifth of households paid almost 70% of all taxes paid at the federal level.